What I'd like to discuss today is, to my mind, and hopefully to yours as well, will be an interesting topic, and that is to get somewhat of an insight into the dispute between the Chassidim and the Misnagdim. What was all this fury about? So what I want to do is first take a step back and just briefly put this into historical context. Now, the truth of the matter, this is a huge issue, which to approach it properly would need kind of a global understanding of what was the novel contribution of the Chassidic movement, what prompted the eruption on the Jewish scene of this ostensibly new approach towards Yiddishkeit of Hasidus. But that's beyond the purview of what I want to address today. We're really going to focus on a micro component of this issue, which is the concept of Torah Lishma, learning Torah for its own sake, but at least on some kind of superficial level, just to put things in historical context. Founder of the Chassidic movement, the Baal Shem Tov, 1698 to 1760. 1698 to 1760, Ukraine. Now, the Chassidic movement, though it's normally attributed to the Baal Shem Tov, the truth of the matter is, like often the founders of a new movement, they're not necessarily the best organizers in the world. So the Chassidic movement as a revolutionary movement, which conquered the hearts and minds of, I think it's fair to say, even the majority of Eastern European Jews. By the way, the way you see this, it's interesting in modern Israel, when you go to a minyan, especially here in Gush Etzion, where we all live here, most of us. So a lot of shuls, they don't have a set nusach. They have I call it dealer's choice. Whatever the person, the Baal Tefillah, so if he's uses Nusach Ashkenaz, then he davens that tefillah is Nusach Ashkenaz, and or if it's Sfard, what people call Sfard, then that'll be the Nusach for that particular davening. Now that's in an Ashkenazi shul, right? If it's Edot HaMizrach, that's a different story. But it's interesting to me to how many times you'll see a young Israeli, or not necessarily young, they daven Nusach Sfard. What's Nusach Sfard, right? We're not talking about Sfaradi, right? That's when in Israel they call it Edot HaMizrach, the communities of the East, right? As in Middle East, right? But Sfard is actually Nusach Ari. It is the Sidur which was created by the Ari, the great Kabbalist, Rabbi Yitzhak Luria, coming from 16th century Svat, who created a nusach of davening based upon Kabbalistic considerations. And it's called Sfard because mistakenly, since it has certain components that are common to the Sephardic version of davening, people start to call it Nusach Sfard, but it is not Nusach Sfard. And if you take a look at a real Sephardi Nusach, they're not the same thing, okay? But question is, why are all these Israelis who are here in Gush Etzion wearing sandals and shorts and a little knitted kippah, they don't exactly look like Chassidim to me? It's because many of the Jews who live in Israel, they come from Poland, right? Not they themselves, but their grandparents, great-grandparents, whatever it is. Ukraine, whatever, all these areas where the Hasidic movement took hold. And the Hasidic movement adopted this Sidur, Nusach Sfard, right? This Kabbalistic Sidur. And so that Nusach, that's why they're davening from a Hasidic Nusach.
No, there's actually, sorry for interjecting, I think there's a much more pragmatic reason that so many people, I know people whose families are Yiddish families, they came from Germany and they daven Sfard. It's because It's because the yeshivot B'nai Akiva, which is a whole chain of high schools, and the yeshivot Hesder, in order to try and find a middle nusach between Sfaradim and Ashkenazim, chose Nusach Sfarad as a middle path, but that's a pragmatic reason.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. And that makes a lot of sense. And I'm sure there's tremendous truth to that. So let's just put those two things together. That it happens to be a historical fact, which I was trying to demonstrate, but your point, I think, is very good, right? But it is a historical fact that, I don't know about the people that are participating right now live to the shiur, if you said, who your grandparents were, right? Did they come, or your great-grandparents, they come from Chassidic stock? Many of us do. Okay, right? That's historical fact. So, and Danny, your point is well taken, that it was used perhaps to kind of bridge that gap between Sephardim and real Sephardim and Ashkenazim. Is a very good point. So it's not necessarily the best proof in the world. I appreciate that, Danny. Thank you. Set me straight. Just keep your eye on me, okay? As I'm sure you will. Okay. In any case, the Baal Shem Tov was not the greatest organizer in the world. Where'd the movement as a movement come from? So it actually came not from the Baal Shem Tov, but from his students. So the Baal Shem Tov had one of his most famous disciples was Rabbi Dov Ber, the Maggid of Mizrich Maggid. You may have heard of him. So he really started the Chassidic movement. Why? Because he was a master organizer. He gathered around him a group of brilliant students, among them Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Ladi, the founder of Chabad Chassidut, among them Rabbi Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev, very famous, perhaps one of the most famous Chassidic Rebbeim, the author of Kedushat Levi. And each one of these disciples set up their own kind of sect. I don't know if maybe that's not it's a loaded term, but their own sphere of influence in different communities in Eastern Europe. And that's how the Chassidic movement spread, through the disciples of Rabbi Dov Ber, the Mizrich Maggid. Now, one of the most powerful and dynamic leaders among these students, as I mentioned before, Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Ladi, the founder of Chabad. Now, he's extremely important in understanding the opposition to Chassidut among the so-called Misnagdim. Why? Because the Baal Shem Tov lived in Ukraine. Ukraine, relatively speaking, is a little far from Lithuania. I mean, it's not really far, but relatively speaking. The problem with Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Ladi, the founder of Chabad Chassidut, he sets up shop in what now is called Belarus, White Russia, which in Jewish terms back then is just Greater Lithuania. So you have now this very vibrant Chassidic movement, Chabad, which is breathing down the neck, as it were, of the stronghold of pure Talmudic traditional Judaism, centered in Vilna, around the personality of the Vilna Gaon.
Rabbi?
Yeah.
Was the appeal actually to other Litvaks or to sort of like disenchanted masses of Jews who were no longer quite so involved in anything per se, davening or learning, or who was the target audience, so to speak, of this movement?
Everybody. But, this is early. We're not talking about people who have stopped keeping Shabbos. That's Chabad nowadays. Chabad under Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Ladi, 1745 to 1813, right? It's the time of Napoleon. Right? We're talking about before traditional Judaism has, crumbled. So he's in the heartbed of Lithuanian Talmudic Judaism, okay, led by the Vilna Gaon, 1720 to 1797. And so now it's arousing tremendous opposition from the Vilna Gaon, who sees the Chassidic movement as a mortal threat to normative Talmudic Judaism. Now, what I want to address today is what's so threatening about Chassidut that prompted the Vilna Gaon to respond with bans, excommunications on the Chassidim. The Vilna Gaon promulgated 2 excommunications against the Chassidim, one in 1777 and one in 1791. Based upon these bans, one was not allowed to marry a Chassid. You couldn't eat from their shechita, the ritual slaughter, and so on and so forth. And you probably are aware of the great holiday, Yud Tes Kislev, right? The 19th of the month of Kislev, which is when Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Ladi, the founder of Chabad Chassidut, was released from prison. And he was in prison because the opponents, the followers of the Vilna Gaon, slandered him, I guess that's a loaded term, to the Russian government. And he was put in jail as a result of the accusations that he was funding Turkey, the Ottoman Empire, the arch enemy of Russia, and that he was engaged in subversive activities religiously. Excuse me. So he's put in jail, right? So this is all as a result of the Vilna Gaon's leadership and instigation, and whose followers took that to quite an extraordinary length, even including putting this famous rabbi in jail. What's all this fuss about? Nowadays, according to the Holy New York Times, Chassidim and Misnagdim, they're all ultra-Orthodox. It's just one thing, ultra-Orthodox. They all have the same taste in terms of the colors of their clothes. Black and a white shirt. Okay. Like, what's this all about? They're all ultra-Orthodox. What's all this about? It's very hard for us to appreciate. Just as an aside, one of the reasons why we don't appreciate it is because there's been a historical process. And that is that Chassidim became Misnagdim, and Misnagdim became Chassidim. I'm not sure if Misnagdim would agree with what I just said, or Chassidim would agree with it, but I think there's tremendous truth to it, that each side has sort of absorbed, to a certain extent, elements of the other, and everybody's kind of parav right now, right? It's hard to find real Chassidim like used to be in the time of, let's say, the time of the Baal Shem Tov, and the first couple generations after the Baal Shem Tov. And it's hard to find Misnagdim like the Vilna Gaon, okay? They've all kind of like intermingled and influenced each other. You know, the Chassidim learn, right, in a serious way, and that's a sort of in Chassidic culture, that's a status thing, to be someone who's a big Talmid Chacham. That wasn't always true. And they usually daven in a more or less civilized manner, right? And more or less try to abide by the Shulchan Aruch when it comes to davening times, with certain exceptions. And the Misnagdim dance right, in davening, right? And they go to Rebbes for brachas, right? To their own Misnagdic leaders. Like, these are unusual things that didn't exist in the same way back then, but there's been this intermingling. What I'd like to do is take one issue, which is considered by many to be a parting of the ways between Chassidim and Misnagdim, examine it, and ask ourselves as we go through the sources, to what degree does it really seem that there's a justifiable location of the dispute between Misnagdim and Chassidim on this particular issue? Rabbi Norman Lamb, who passed away recently, wrote a book. I think it's actually called Torah Lishma, Torah for its own sake, in which he tries to prove that this was a central issue. I'm not so sure he's right. Let's see, by the time we're done, to what extent this issue should be understood as one of the main parting of the ways between Chassidim and Misnagdim. Okay, so Torah Lishma, Torah for its own sake. What's the source of that? It's a Mishnah. Let's take a look at this Mishnah. So the Mishnah starts out, this is in Avot. This is the following, Rabbi Meir Omer, Kol Osek Torah Lishma. Anybody who's involved in Torah Lishma, for its own sake. Now, the whole question is going to be, what does that mean? Torah for its own sake. Zochet L'Devarim Harbe, merits many things. If you learn Torah for its own sake, now, everybody here who's participating, certainly live, on some level you're learning Torah for its own sake, unless, is it true, Bruce, that you give $100,000 stipend to everybody who participates in the Efrat Kollel?
Well, they get a ticket for the next week.
Yeah, okay, so that's good too. So that may detract from the for its own sake part of learning Torah, but like learning Torah for its own sake, right? And you merit many things, right?
Which means if you really enjoy the shiurim, if you do a really good job, that might destroy the Lishma aspect.
So, well, let's see. First of all, we'll try to define what that is in a minute. But let's just read it in English. I tried to get some English sources here to make things a little bit easier for you. So read it quickly in English. So anybody who learns Torah for its own sake merits many things. Now listen to all these beautiful things here. Not only that, but the entire world is worthwhile for him alone, for you alone. He is called friend and beloved of God. He loves God. He loves man. He brings joy to God. He brings joy to man. It, the Torah, clothes him in humility and fear. This describes everybody in the Efrat Kollel. It's amazing. It enables him to be righteous, pious, upright, and faithful. It distances him from sin and brings him to merit. People gain from him advice and wisdom, understanding and strength. As it says, to me is wisdom, advice and wisdom. I am understanding and strength is mine. That's wisdom speaking, or the Torah speaking. It gives him kingship and dominion and analytical judgment. It reveals to him the secrets of the Torah. He becomes like a waxing stream and an unceasing river. He becomes modest, slow to anger, and forgiving of the wrongs done to him. It makes him great and exalted above all of creation. A beautiful and accurate description of everybody participating in this shiur. Okay? But it's all dependent upon if you learn Torah Lishma for its own sake. Well, I would like to figure out what the heck that means, learning Torah Lishma for its own sake. So what I want to first do is take a look at a really interesting response to what apparently was a widespread misunderstanding, according to this author, as we'll see in a second, of what is Torah Lishma. So this particular source is from a Chassidic Rebbe, but a Chassidic Rebbe in a Mishnadic kind of ambiance. Tremendous Torah scholar. He founded a Chassidic movement called Sachachav, the Sachachav Rebbe, and he wrote a book which is a halacha book. It's called Eglei Tal. It's on the laws of Shabbat. Very scholarly Talmudic work. What considered to be in yeshivas on a very high level, one of the most classic and critical works to understand the notion of malacha on Shabbat. Okay, the things you don't do on Shabbat. So let's take a look at what he said. He died in 1910, Poland. Rabbi Avram Bornstein. Hear what he has to say. This is from his introduction, which is more philosophical. Okay, and he says he wants to discuss the following. There are people who make a mistake in their brains. They're making an intellectual error. Concerning learning our Torah, our holy Torah. What do they say, these people? That someone who learns says novel ideas. They learn in a creative fashion. And therefore, they get joy and delight from the learning. I just want to make sure you understand what he's saying here. Joy from learning is much more profoundly felt if you're creative in your learning. And I have to admit something right off the top right now, personal. I'm going to confess my sins. I have a very hard time learning, for instance, Mishnah. Why? Because it's almost impossible to understand Mishnah on its own, right? And therefore, to daven Mishnah as to read the words without understanding it, on any kind of deep level. I just can't discipline myself to do it. I can't learn Daf Yomi, Mishnah Yomi, or anything like that. Why? Moves too fast, not enough time to think about it in a creative fashion. I don't enjoy it. I enjoy learning, which I do profoundly, when I can sink my teeth into it and think about it creatively. And I think many of you may relate to this idea. The joy of learning is when you think creatively about it. That's the geschmack. That's the joy. That's the onik. So that's what the Sochatchav is saying, that when you learn Torah in this fashion where you're creative, you're mechadesh chidushim, novel ideas, so you enjoy it. But there are people who say that if you do that, ein ze limud haTorah kol kach lishma. That's not Torah Lishma, Torah for its own sake. You know why? Because if you're learning Torah and you enjoy it, you know why you're learning it? For the pleasure. So therefore, that's not really Torah for its own sake. It's for your sake. It's like a kind of intellectual, spiritual hedonism. Hey, this is fun. This is enjoyable. That's not Torah for its own sake. What would be learning Torah Lishma according to this mistaken idea, he says? If you learn it simple, read the words, translate, you're done. And therefore you won't enjoy it. So the way to learn Torah Lishma, according to this opinion that he's going to reject, is learning without joy, learning without delight, by not saying anything novel. Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
And I have the CD Daf that has it in Hebrew, English, and Yiddish, and I really enjoyed it. When I went through 3 times of from the CD Daf, and now I'm doing like everybody else, just a daf a day.
Yeah,
and
that's
really
awesome.
It's got nice people who are saying it, so I enjoy it.
Yeah, and you're a greater man than me and a much better Jew. So for me, I've never been able to enjoy that kind of learning very much, unless I can think about it creatively. But call a kavod to you. Aval halomed umitaneg b'limudo, someone who is learning in this enjoyable way because they're creative, mechadesh chidushim, then a person has mixed into their learning pleasure, their own pleasure. And so there is this opinion out there that says, that's not called Torah Lishma. You're not learning because God commanded. Why are you learning? Because you enjoy it. Not Torah Lishma anymore. So now the Sochatchav, don't be confused. He's not saying that this is true. He's saying that there's this widespread view out there that thinks if you enjoy it too much, it takes away from the mitzvah. Because you're not doing it because the king commanded, the king of kings, but because it's fun. So he now says, yeah.
Do we have an idea that if you start low lishma, you'll end up with a lishma? So
yeah. And you'll see at the very end of this whole analysis, which will take us a couple of sessions, we're going to end with that comment and a really interesting interpretation from the most recent Lubavitch Rebbe about that idea. We'll get to there. So he says, before Sami, he says, this is a big mistake. Big mistake. to think that if you learn it in a creative way, which gives you this pleasure and delight out of learning, and that's what's motivating you, that it takes away from being Torah Lishma, Torah for its own sake, this is a big mistake. The Adarabah Kizehu Ikar Mitzvat Limud Torah. He says, not only is it a big mistake, it's exactly the opposite. That in fact, the main concept of the mitzvah of learning Torah is to enjoy it. Liot sas v'sameach u'mitaneg b'limudo, to feel joy and delight in the learning. Ve'az divrei Torah nivla'im b'damo, because only then is the Torah absorbed in your blood. It's like, right? When you have a geschmack from it, you enjoy it, and you're being creative, it becomes part of you, right? It becomes absorbed in your blood. And since you're now enjoying it, you become attached to the Torah. You're motivated. You love it. He says, so it's not taking away from Torah Lishma. It's the whole concept of Torah. It's a necessary condition in learning Torah is to feel that joy, which usually comes by being creative, savoring it, thinking about it, asking questions, coming up with creative answers, arguing with your chavrus or your teacher about it. Ubezorah Kadosh. And now he wants to prove it from the Zohar. He's going to prove from the Zohar that learning Torah in a way which gives you delight does not take away from learning Torah for its own sake. How so? Zohar says the following, that we'll just focus on half of it, the Yetzer Hara and the Yetzer Tov, both sides, become greater, strengthened through joy. That Simcha is the fuel that increases both the Yetzer Tov and Yetzer Hara, the evil impulse and the good impulse. How so? Yetzer Tov mikamatok simcha shel Torah. The Zohar goes on and says, Yetzer Tov, your positive impulse, it becomes strengthened and grows through simcha, through joy. But which kind of simcha? Simcha of Torah. When you learn Torah out of joy, it strengthens and fortifies like vitamins for your Yetzer Tov. That's the Zohar. So now he points out the following. V'im amar t'shar yedei asimcha sheyisho belimud nikra shelo lishma. That doesn't make any sense to the Zohar. If you say that when you learn Torah out of joy, it takes away from learning Torah for its own sake, or kol panim lishma v'lo lishma, or at least it's some kind of like watering down of learning Torah for its own sake, if you're getting joy out of it, harei simcha zod migarei koach hamitzvah mikocha ora. Then the simcha of learning Torah is somehow detracting and diminishing from the mitzvah of learning Torah. How could it be, the Zohar says, if you learn Torah in a state of joy, you love it, it's a delight, you're being creative, that somehow is going to increase your Yetzer Tov, your good impulse? That Zohar makes no sense. If you learn Torah in this creative way, which gives you joy, that somehow is diminishing from the mitzvah. How could it be that a diminished form of the mitzvah is that which particularly increases your good impulse? So that's the proof from the Zohar. So since the Yetzer Tov, the Zohar says, is fortified through this joyful, creative learning of Torah, that must be really the main spiritual, emotional, psychological content of learning Torah. Okay, so I'll just sort of summarize the last paragraph here, and he says that, so what is learning Torah shelo lishma? What would that be? What's learning Torah not for its own sake? He says it's if you're learning Torah because, for instance, let's say for honor. You want to be called rabbi. or you're learning Torah in order to power in certain communities. Torah's power, right? Or even, let's say, a less negative form of Shlo Lishma. What if you're a Harvard professor in Jewish studies? You don't observe any mitzvahs at all. You don't even believe in God. God forbid. But it's interesting. So instead of being a professor of Greek literature, you're a professor of Talmudic literature. That's Shlo Lishma. But to learn Torah out of joy and creativity, that's Torah Lishma. Okay, so what have we done so far? We've tried to show what an incorrect understanding of Torah Lishma, right? It doesn't mean that you have to learn Torah just because God commanded and don't get any joy out of it, right? That's what the Sukha was trying to explain. That to learn Torah out of joy and delight is definitely part of Torah Lishma. Okay, but it still hasn't defined, so what is Torah Lishma, right? We're just pointing out that learning Torah in a delightful way and creatively, that doesn't detract from Torah Lishma. But we don't know what Torah Lishma is. So now, I want to begin our process of defining positively what is Torah Lishma, Torah for its own sake. So we're going to start with the Chassidim. Remember, we pointed out that Rabbi Shner Zalman of Ladi, he was particularly the arch enemy, or the arch threat, perhaps we could say, of the Vilna Gaon. And we pointed out part of that is because he's breathing down his neck. They're in the same neighborhood. I want to just take a step back and point out Rabbi Shner Zalman of Ladi, the founder of Chabad Chassidut, was 25 years younger than the Vilna Gaon. So when Rabbi Shner Zalman of Ladi was old enough to start learning in a serious way to make decisions about his life, the Vilna Gaon was very famous, older Jewish leader. And Rabbi Shner Zalman of Ladi, it was a famous story, he considered to go to Vilna and to become a disciple of the Vilna Gaon. The founder of Chabad Chassidut almost became one of the chief disciples of the Vilna Gaon. It's a famous story, some of you may have heard, that he ended up not going to Vilna. Why? Because he said to himself, and he was a Talmudic genius, Rabbi Shner Zalman of Ladi. He said to himself, okay, he could go to Vilna and learn with one of the greatest Talmudic geniuses who's ever lived. Or he could go and study with the chief disciple of the Baal Shem Tov, Rabbi Dov Ber, the Mizritcher Magi. Now, he did a cost-benefit analysis. What is the benefit of going to Vilna? He would progress in his Gemara learning, his Talmudic scholarship. If he goes to Rabbi Dov Ber, the Mizritcher Magi, the chief disciple of Baal Shem Tov, he'll learn how to daven. So he said to himself the following: you know what? I kind of feel comfortable in the world of Talmudic scholarship, Gemara learning. I know something about that. But I don't know anything about how to daven. So he went to Rabbi Dov Ber, and the rest is history, right? He became a Chassid and founded perhaps the most dynamic Chassidic dynasty. It's also important to mention that he was a particular threat, Rabbi Shner Zalman of Ladi, not just because he was in the same territory as the Vilna Gaon. Any Beit Midrash, whether it is Chassidic or Misnagdic, right? Or in Israel, people say, Litai, a Litvish Beit Midrash, will have on its shelf a series of volumes that are called Shulchan Aruch Harav. It's a Shulchan Aruch, but it's a Shulchan Aruch not from the 16th century, written by Rabbi Yosef Karo. It's an update of the Shulchan Aruch, written by Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Ladi. The Rebbe of Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Ladi, the Mezritcher Magid, wanted to create a updated Shulchan Aruch. He needed a Talmudic genius to do it. And he commissioned his youngest student. Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Ladi was the youngest student of the Mezritcher Magid. And the Mezritcher Magid saw that this was a Talmudic genius, even though he was the youngest of the crew. And he commissioned to create a Shulchan Aruch. Danny, way to go. So God bless you. See that? It says Shulchan Aruch. So that is the Rav's Shulchan Aruch, Shulchan Aruch Harav. Okay, so don't be misled when it says Shulchan Aruch. It's not the 16th century Shulchan Aruch. It's from the 19th century. Okay?
Were things always black and white? You had to be in one camp or the other. You couldn't meld them, like you mentioned about Rav Kook.
Yeah. So we're going to get to Rav Kook, but now the answer is it sort of depends when and where. In the early, when this fight erupted between the Vilna Gaon and Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Ladi, so especially if you lived in Lithuania, it's either or. I mean, the Chassidim have been excommunicated by the Vilna Gaon and by the other rabbis of Vilna, except for there was movement. So people crossed borders, but they didn't usually integrate, which I think you're referring to, sort of integrate both worlds. But there was quite a bit of crossing from one to the other, but it usually went in one direction. There weren't too many Chassidim who became Misnagdim, but there were a lot of Misnagdim who became Chassidim, and that's what made the Vilna Gaon.
But why was this huge rift? I mean, what troubled the Gaon?
Yeah, that's what we're talking about, and we're gonna. I'm
trying to get there.
Yeah, I'm building up to it. I'm warming up. So one of the alleged issues is Torah Lishma. Okay, that's why we're talking about this. So, and now the interesting thing to see, Danny, as we go on is like if we can appreciate why there'd be such a terrible, passionate fight over the concept of Torah Lishma.
Is there any politics involved in this, or do you think it's purely theological issues?
You mean, is there any power issues? That's what
you're other factors.
Yeah. So I'm sure that there are historians who would attribute it to issues of power, which use power, money, these kinds of things. So I don't know personally. It's usually presented more in sort of theological garb, right? That there are certain ideas in Chassidut which somehow threaten fundamental notions of normative Judaism as the Vilna Gaon understood it. One of them is Torah Lishma. Okay. Now we're gonna pause here. Danny's just like he's not gonna be able to sleep for the next week. So what we're gonna do, let me just tell you what we're gonna be doing, is that we're going to take a look at several passages from Tanya. So Tanya, as I'm sure many of you are aware of, was the magnum opus philosophically, spiritually of Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Ladi, in which he defines what is Torah Lishma. We're going to see those sources, and then we're going to see the reaction. It happens to be that the chief disciple of the Vilna Gaon, his name is Rabbi Chaim of Volozhin, wrote a non-Chassidic Tanya, as it were, called Nefesh HaChaim. So we're going to pit these two books against each other. Tanya on the one hand, Nefesh HaChaim on the other. We're going to compare and contrast. And then we're going to see how some others weighed in on this, particularly Rav Kook weighs in a very interesting way on this issue, even surprising. And then we're going to try to appreciate why this became such a hot button issue, and to what extent it's justifiable to see this as a great parting of the ways between the Chassidim and the Misnagdim. And
wasn't Tanya printed the last year of life of the Vilna Gaon? Vilna Gaon died in 1797. Tanya was printed in 1796.
So that's why it's Rav Chaim, the disciple of the Vilna Gaon, who responds to Tanya, right? But it's not as if the Vilna Gaon was unaware of the philosophy of Rabbi Shneur Zalman Ladi. He didn't have to learn Tanya, the Vilna Gaon, to know what Rabbi Shneur Zalman Ladi was preaching. As a matter of fact, and I don't want to take time from the next speaker, but Rabbi Shneur Zalman Ladi says in his introduction, the only reason he wrote the book was because normally people would come to him and he would teach them Chassidus. But his movement became too big and he couldn't do it anymore, right? There's not enough time in the day to be able to teach all the people who want to learn about Chassidus. So he thought he would put it into a book. So the Vilna Gaon didn't have to wait for the book to know what Rabbi Shneur Zalman thought. These are ideas that were promulgated among some of his own students who became Chassidim, even way before Tanya was published as a book. And on that note, we will press pause and we'll continue Be'ezrat Hashem next week.